Dear class, welcome back to International Relations. We are looking at chapter 1 of Minks and McKibben, and we talked about approaches in IR. So, what do we mean when we say approach, right? So, technically, we're talking about research approach, ways of investigating a problem. How do we come to know what the problem is? Okay, so we are looking at how different people have investigated international relations questions. Okay, so they have a research question. What have they done to investigate? So here I've listed some approaches that people have used over thousands of years. Okay, and we'll talk about the more current stuff, but let's look a little bit at the older things. So I mentioned here myths and religions as dominant uh, ways of thinking in ancient times, especially, and realism sort of developing as a way of thinking, of explaining things. From ancient times and sort of becoming more prominent in maybe the last 200-300 years. So let's look at a popular question in IR. What causes war? Okay, so let's see how the various approaches will answer this question. If you look at ancient writings, the causes of war are essentially to do with upsetting some kinds of gods, right? So religion and myths from the very ancient times may explain war in terms of the actions and involvement of gods, or maybe the wars themselves are happening because gods got involved, or started the war. So in the Bhagavad Gita, for example, Arjuna is told by Lord Krishna to go to war against Arjuna's evil cousins who want to take their throne and land, essentially. In the Old Testament and the Quran, similarly, some nations are destroyed because they were wayward, and the destruction is explained in terms of God's wrath. Over time, the explanations have shifted from the activities of gods, partly because of the rise of monotheistic religion. So where you have like uh, many of the Western tradition is sort of folk, sort of starts with Christianity, Judaism, Islam. And so you see that these people at some point have stopped explaining or using God to explain why wars happen, and they've started to blame human nature. Human nature is so bad and evil that wars are happening throughout time. So if you look at the writings of Saint Augustine or Hans Morgenthau, you might see this kind of psychoanalysis. Within this philosophical tradition, you see the transfer of blame from gods to humans. So let's look at the second, deductive tradition. What is this? So instead of collecting data or observing human nature, writing it down in a systematic fashion, like we often do today when we do research, in those days, people also observed what was happening around them and they wrote about what was happening, but they didn't do it in a systematic way. And they often shared their ideas or their deductions based on observations, but also argumentation. So it wasn't purely based on, what they were observing. There was no systematic process of collecting the data, but some level of observation was happening because they were commenting on society. So before the early 20th century, this was the norm in the social sciences. People wrote philosophical essays, entire books discussing their ideas or theories. Historical tradition. So some scholars focus, they do their work on these wars that happened, like historical cases of war, right? So they want to become experts or tell you the in-depth story of what happened in this war. So they might be interested in looking at relations, to understand what caused war, but they don't do it in the way that we do it these days in science, right? Where we say, okay, force caused acceleration. The force acting on mass caused acceleration. It doesn't happen like that, but they are still trying to understand what caused war by exploring these historical narratives. An example is writing by a general. His name was Thucydides, and he wrote about the war that was happening in ancient Greece in about, between 300 and 400 BC. And he wrote his book. It's called The History of the Peloponnesian War. And Thucydides says, oh, look, I actually gave you an account of what happened historically. I interviewed people and I found out what really happened. And apparently, he took several decades to write this, and he was very careful. He would, go and talk to people, and he would come back and do corrections and things like that. So he was trying to do something in a more systematic fashion where he actually talked to people, what we might consider to be a scientific process, right? He was talking to people and writing down. Of course, his own interpretations were in there. And so we're not sure how systematic this was, but most people think it is a pretty good account of what happened, even though it has a lot of commentary, maybe personal ideas or viewpoints of Thucydides. Normative theories. So these aren't necessarily research questions about how things happen. They don't stop at how investigating how things happen, but they go on to give a prescription about what should happen. So you look at writings like Immanuel Kant, Perpetual Peace, he kind of takes for granted, sort of, and he says, oh, this is why wars happen, but how can we stop them? So he goes into a different sort of agenda in the book. So let's stop here as far as approaches, and we'll look at some other stuff in our next lecture.